Welcome to the Hampden-Hampshire and Franklin Conservation District's Winter Workshop Series on native plants. Tonight's talk is by Amy Meltzer. Amy is on the steering committee of the Mass Pollinator Network, is an active member of Grow Native Massachusetts, and is on both the research team and the Natural Solutions Working Group of the Elders Climate Action. She has been researching and growing native plants for over 10 years. Tonight's presentation is titled Gardening for Biodiversity with Native Plants, Providing Habitat for Pollinators, Birds, and Other Essential Wildlife. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you so much, Megan. And thanks to everyone who's here, and hello to everyone who might be watching this later. So as Megan said, I'm going to be talking about gardening for biodiversity and talking about how using native plants is really the basis for creating habitat that supports many other species. I'm going to cover tonight the biodiversity crisis. I'm just going to give an introduction to that because it really explains why it's so important that we create habitat. I'll be talking about how many different species, plants, trees, insects, birds, and others have evolved to be interdependent and depend on each other for survival. And then I'll talk about how to garden to support biodiversity. At the end, I have a lot of resource slides, which I'll go through very quickly. Megan is going to send those to everyone. And there's just a wealth of information in there. So I'll show you what you'll be getting from those. And I should say most of the pictures here are pictures I've taken in my garden. I really have a wonderful time watching insects interact with flowers. So starting with the biodiversity crisis, in the last few years, reports have been coming out from the UN climate and biodiversity scientists telling us that climate change and biodiversity loss are equal threats to human well-being and our existence. Around the world, there are about 1 million animal and plant species at risk of extinction, many within decades. And they're telling us if we don't deal with these crises together, they will get worse. There's things we can do to help limit climate change, but if we're not taking the local ecology into account, sometimes we're making things worse for nature, which we also depend on for absorbing carbon. In the US, this was a separate report made by scientists in North America that currently there are 34% of plant species, 40% of animal species, and 41% of ecosystems are at risk of extinction. So I'm starting with the bad news. I'm going to give you a little more, and then we'll move to the good news, which is there is action we can take to reverse this. So in the last 50 years, we've lost 2.9 billion birds, which is almost 29% of the bird population in North America. And a major reason for this is that birds, either adult birds or their young, depend on insects as food. And around the world, 41% of insect species are declining in numbers and are at risk. So birds are losing a major food source, and as a result, we're losing many birds. Insect populations are falling so rapidly that if we don't slow this and reverse it, they could be gone by the end of the century. In Massachusetts, we have 400 native bee species. Some are declining, and it's not too late to take action on this. But I do like to say here that most of us grow up hearing a lot and learning a lot about honeybees, and honeybees are actually not native to our hemisphere. They are not at risk as a species, and they actually compete with native bees for resources. So I do have a resource slide if anyone wants to learn more about that. I have a lot of videos and articles that explain that in more detail. E.O. Wilson was an American biologist and naturalist who died a couple of years ago, and he said, if all mankind were to disappear, the world would regenerate back to the rich state of equilibrium that existed 10,000 years ago. If insects were to vanish, the environment would collapse into chaos. And I find this really striking because I think a lot of us grow up thinking of insects as dangerous or annoying or insignificant. And in fact, They're really essential for the healthy functioning of all ecosystems. They pollinate many of our food crops, so there's a lot of fresh produce we wouldn't have without insects. They pollinate 90% of flowering plants, so that means most plants depend on insects in order to reproduce. Insects are food for many species, as you can see in this picture. And beyond that, many of the species that eat insects are eaten by other species, so they're kind of a fundamental part of the food web. Insects help things decompose, so anything that dies, animal or vegetable, needs to be broken down to become nutrients for further life to develop. They also aid in sequestering carbon in soil, so they're helping us with climate change. And a report that came out about 3 years ago showed that around the world, there are about 400,000 people a year who are dying because of ill health, because of a lack of fresh food as a result of a lack of pollinators. So the decline in insect populations is already affecting human health and mortality. There are a number of causes of the decline in insects, but habitat loss is the greatest cause, and there's several factors involved in that. One is industrial agriculture. You can see a picture of, huge field, monocrop. Um, most of them are soaked with pesticides and herbicides and chemical fertilizers, so they're not suitable habitat for insects to survive in. Deforestation is another cause. There are many species that live in forests. Urbanization is another. The more we pave things over and hardscape things, the less habitat there is for insects. There are definitely ways to bring nature into cities, even small gardens, planting trees along streets. I mean, there's definitely movement in that direction, which is really important, and that's very helpful. We really can help insects survive with planting native plants in cities. And another kind of habitat loss is the widespread use of non-native plants. And I will be explaining that in more detail, that non-native plants don't provide the kind of support that native insects need to either be able to feed themselves or feed their young. And then there are also landscape practices that are widely used that are destructive of insects and other life. And I'll be explaining what we can do differently so that we make our landscapes supportive of life. Pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizers are all detrimental. All of these things I'll be talking about a little more. Invasive plants and insects destroy habitat. Light pollution is a big problem. I'll be explaining that a little more. And obviously, climate change. When we have huge floods, heat waves, fires, that's destructive of habitat. So in this section, I'll be talking about how all these different species, plants, insects, birds, and fungi have evolved to depend on each other. And again, these pictures are all from my garden. I really get a lot of pleasure from watching all these species interact. So first, I'm going to give some definitions. Native plants are plants that evolve with other species in a given area, and they provide many benefits to each other. People define the geography of native in different ways. The important thing is that the species are beneficial to each other. So some people will look for plants that are native to their county or to their state or to their ecoregion. There are maps that show you ecoregions which cross state boundaries. Some people will use plants from, north of the Appalachians, east of the Mississippi. So there's different ways of defining it and finding plants. And again, I think the important thing is that they do support other life, that they're, for instance, plants from California are from the US, but it's a totally different ecosystem out there. So those plants would not be considered native here. Non-native plants are plants from other ecoregions or other continents that provide either limited or no support for local species of insects and birds. And I'll be showing you even plants that were brought here hundreds of years ago by colonists and have, they grow here like daisies, daylilies. Some people are surprised to hear they aren't native because, they thrive in our climate conditions. And even though they can grow well here and be healthy, they don't provide the same level of support to other species. They haven't evolved to have those beneficial interactions. And invasive plants are non-native plants that crowd out native plants. You can see in this picture, and I'm sure you've seen this in your area. Some of them are vines that smother trees and bring them down. There are others that spread by their roots. Some of them exude chemicals that poison the ground around them so that other plants can't grow there. So they're very disruptive of ecosystems because they're taking over habitat from native plants. So native plants and insects have been co-evolving for 125 million years. And as a result, plants depend on insects to pollinate them in order to reproduce. Insects depend on plants for food, both for adults and their offspring. So I want to go back just for 1 second. There are some plants that are pollinated by the wind. They don't have flowers because they don't need to attract insects, but the vast majority of plants depend on insects to pollinate them. Plants protect themselves from being devoured by insects with several defense mechanisms. And a major one is that they produce chemicals that make them either unpalatable or toxic to insects. And in response, insects have evolved to produce chemicals that allow them to feed on the plant without being poisoned by it. But they've only done that for specific plants. And so as a result, there are many, many specialized insect-plant relationships, so that 90% of insects require specific plants for food, and either the adult insects or their young can't survive without those particular plants. And most plants can only be pollinated by limited species of insects. So this is really fascinating to read about. There's a lot of information about this. I'll just give a few examples, but plants and insects have evolved traits that enable them to kind of match up and interact and benefit each other. So insects can sense flower color. They can see some colors that we can't, like some flowers have ultraviolet patterns in them that insects can see. It's almost like a signaling system that tells them where to land to be able to get pollen and nectar. Insects have developed shapes that match flowers. So you can see in this picture that bumblebee fits really nicely into that tubular penstemon. Insects can sense scent. They can sense the temperature of plants. They can even sense electromagnetic fields. So this is really fun to learn about. There's some insects that have fuzz on their bodies that actually bend when they're close to a plant that has a different electrical charge than the insect has. Also, this charge enables the pollen to stick to the insect bodies more effectively. So there's many, many, many tricks in nature that are really fun to learn about that show how these different species have evolved together. So most imported plants and even most hybridized plants, which are plants that humans have changed different characteristics of, provide little to no benefit to insects. So here's a few examples of ways that they've developed specialized relationships. This one has to do with shape. So these are two different kinds of monarda or bee balm. They have long, thin, tubular flowers, and they can be pollinated only by insects that have long tongues. So there are long-tongued bees, there are long-tongued moths, and then hummingbirds have those long, thin beaks. So they can be pollinated by all of those. And they're insects that have short tongues that can't reach the pollen or nectar, so they can't effectively interact with those flowers. And then here's another example of flowers that have thick, closed petals. The blue gentian on the left actually stays closed all the time. It's a little fuzzy, but you can see a bumblebee pushing its way in there. So these kind of flowers can only be pollinated by bumblebees because they're the only insects that are large enough to push their way into those flowers. And that's another opportunity to have fun in the garden, is to watch them push in and then hear them buzzing around in there. And oh, I'll show this next actually, and then go back. Bumblebees do something called buzz pollination. So they buzz at a certain frequency that shakes pollen loose from certain plants. So they actually increase the yield of tomatoes, blueberries, eggplant, and other food crops, and are the most effective pollinators of those crops. So here's another example. This is a specialized chemical relationship. So I'm sure you've all heard that monarch butterflies are in trouble and are declining in big numbers. And they lay their eggs on milkweed. So if you look on the left, you can see that little white ball on the leaf. That's a monarch butterfly egg on a milkweed plant. And then you look on the right, that's a monarch caterpillar. The monarchs only lay their eggs on milkweed because when the caterpillars hatch, milkweed is the only plant they can safely eat. So if you, the adult butterfly can go and get nectar and feed itself from many different flowers. But if you want to support the next generation of monarch butterflies, the caterpillars need food, and so you need to plant milkweed for them. And there's several species of milkweed, and some of them are wonderful in gardens. So I showed you that slide. So another thing to be aware of is that adult and the larval form of insects have different food needs. And native plants enable them to reproduce and support the next generation. So with moths and butterflies, as I was talking about with the milkweed, they lay eggs on leaves. And here's another example. This is a spice bush butterfly, and that really cute caterpillar is a spice bush caterpillar, and it can only eat spice bush leaves. So that's, just an example, but there are many others of moths and butterflies that need particular plants that they lay their eggs on. The caterpillars eat the leaves. And I'll be showing you some research soon that there are thousands of caterpillars needed as food for just one nest of baby birds. And most caterpillars can eat the leaves only of specific plant species. So those plants are known as host plants, the ones that can support the next generation of insects. And then bees collect pollen from plants that they store in their nests. And again, different from what we know about honeybees, most native bees are solitary. They don't live in hives. Many of them dig tunnels in the ground or in wood, and they lay eggs in the tunnels. When they collect pollen, they store pollen balls next to the eggs. When the eggs hatch, the bee larvae eat the pollen. And similar to what happens with moths and butterflies, most bees can only eat pollen from certain plants. So those are the host plants for bees. So in order to support the next generation of pollinators and have them not die out, we need to plant host plants. And those are native plants. They're particular native plants. And again, in the resource slides, I'll be giving you lists of plants that can do that. So what this means is there are going to be caterpillars eating your leaves if you're supplying them with host plants. And I have learned, instead of looking at a leaf with holes in it, like you can see on the left, and thinking, oh no, what's wrong with my plant? Something's eating it. I have to do something. I'm very excited now because this plant is doing its job in the ecosystem. There are either moth or butterfly larvae eating it. And they will either grow up to be moths and butterflies and be pollinators, or while they're still in the caterpillar phase, they'll be food for birds. So they're doing their job. And as someone said to me, if it bothers you to see the leaves, the holes in the leaves, you can just step back and there's that healthy birch tree that these leaves are from. So it's really not hurting the tree. We do have infestations of non-native invasive insects that will decimate the leaves on a tree, but the trees have evolved to support native insects and be able to handle this minor amount of damage. So this is the research I was talking about the number of caterpillars that are needed. Desiree Narango was the student of Doug Tallamy, who I'll talk about a little later. He's a leading researcher in insect-plant interactions. And she found that chickadees need 6 to 9,000 caterpillars to raise one nest of baby birds. And this is before the birds fledge. I'm sure you've seen young birds hopping around on the ground that are just learning to fly and their parents are still coming and feeding them. This is before that phase. It's while they're still in the nest, they need that many caterpillars. And these are chickadees, which are little birds. So obviously bigger birds are going to need more. So what she found was she was looking at the woody native plants, the shrubs and trees in the neighborhood, because even though there are herbaceous plants like milkweed that will support caterpillars, you know that trees and shrubs have many, many, many more leaves. So they're actually providing a lot more food for caterpillars. So what she found is if there were 94 to 100% native woody plants in a neighborhood, the birds did very well. And when the amount of woody native plants dropped below 70%, there wasn't enough food for the birds and some of them starved. So people are using this as a rule of thumb that for a viable self-sustaining ecosystem, we need to have at least 70% native plant biomass. So it's not 70% counting the numbers of plants, it's looking at the mass of foliage, of the native plant material that's in your landscape. And here I'll show you how non-native plants don't support native species. This is from one of Doug Tallamy's books. If you look on the far left, that's a list of plants that were brought here from other continents. The list of numbers just to the right shows you how many species these plants support in their native range, where they came from. So this ranges from 40 species to over 400 for each plant. The next column shows the number of species they support in North America, and that ranges from 0 to 8. And then the next column shows you how long they've been in North America, and that's between 100 and over 300 years. So that kind of evolution just doesn't seem to happen quickly for insects to be able to develop the ability to feed off of plants introduced from other regions. So the native plants are just vastly more beneficial. Here's an example with trees, native oak trees and non-native ginkgo trees. So ginkgo trees are native to China. They support one species in the US, and they've been here almost 250 years. Native oak trees support more species than any other plant. They support, actually, I think I didn't update this slide. They support a lot more insect species than that. They also support small mammals and birds. They're just really the most beneficial plant you could put in the ground if you have room for an oak tree. And there are some that aren't enormous. But in general, native plants support 13 times more insect species than non-native plants do. And non-native plants tend to support 0 to 5 insect species. So among flowering plants, among grasses, among trees, native plants are just vastly more beneficial. I had talked about the lack of support from hybrid plants. So I'm going to show you an example using echinacea. So actually this picture was taken at a nursery in Cummington. That's the original species of echinacea. You can see all these different kinds of butterflies on it. On the right, you can see a goldfinch eating echinacea seeds in the fall. So this is how native plant species support the ecosystem. They provide nectar for adult insects. They provide pollen and leaves to feed the offspring of insects. They develop seed for birds, and they have genetic variability. If you have the straight species and you're allowing it to be pollinated out in the wild, with pollen being carried from one flower to another, the offspring will vary. And the benefit of that is, I mean, this has always been beneficial. I think it's even more important now dealing with climate change. is that with the variation in the characteristics of the plants, if you have an adverse event like a flood or a heat wave, or a difference in when winter starts or stops, some of the plants may be able to handle that condition. If they were all genetically identical, it could be that they all get wiped out and that plant is just gone. So that's one of the benefits of growing native plants and allowing them to be naturally pollinated. And I'm going to show you some hybridized echinacea in the next slide. But the original species of a plant that has not been changed by humans messing around with it just has a two-word Latin name. So this is Echinacea purpurea. And the hybrid will have, of any plant, any hybridized plant, will have the two Latin names, but it will also have a name after it in quotes. So this yellow one is called Echinacea purpurea sunrise. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the detrimental effects of hybrids or cultivars. They're changed by humans because, they think this is going to look pretty and somebody's going to want to grow it in their garden because they like how it looks. So here's an example on the bottom. This red one is really altered to the point where it doesn't have pollen, it doesn't have nectar, it won't produce seeds. Many hybridized plants, even the one at the top, is still more functional, but often the nutritional value of the nectar and the pollen are reduced. Sometimes the shape is changed in a way that makes it non-functional, like I'm thinking of a plant whose name I can't remember at the moment. It'll float back up in a minute. Lobelia cardinalis. Um, it has long red tubular flowers. There's a hybrid that looks very similar to the original, but the flowers are a little bit bigger, and they're just long enough that no insects can get their tongue to reach the pollen and the nectar. So they can't pollinate it, they can't get food from it. And the other aspect of hybrids that's not beneficial is that they're being hybridized because nurseries want to sell them to people and they want people to know exactly what they're going to get. So they're clones. They're not being allowed to, even the ones that will produce nectar and pollen, they're not being allowed to reproduce by seed and have genetic variation. So as I said before, if they're all exactly the same, they can all be wiped out in one adverse event. So there are some hybrids that do retain ecological value. There's some research being done. But if you're shopping for plants and you want to be sure you're getting native plants that are going to be beneficial to other species, it's best to stick with the straight species that won't have that extra name at the end. And there's a lot of false advertising. I have a catalog that I get that has a 2-page spread of echinacea. One is the original hybrid. One of them is this red one that, you might as well just be hanging a picture in your garden. It's something to look at, but it's not relating to the rest of nature around it. But this catalog is telling everyone that all these echinacea plants are good for pollinators. So you have to be a little careful. Unless you're shopping at a native plant nursery, other nurseries, you have to know which questions to ask. And I'll give you a little advice about that later on. So some native plants have a broader benefits than others. So I was talking about I was talking about host plants. There are keystone plants that support a vast number of insect species. So about 5% of native plant species feed 75% of insect species. So in the resource slides, you'll get a spreadsheet or a list of keystone plants. The other plants are important too. I mean, the blue lupin, the native lupin, supports the blue Carner butterfly. So it's supporting one insect as far as I know, but that insect needs that lupin plant to survive. So, keystone plants are wonderful and good to have in your garden, but it's good to have variety beyond those too. And then other plants that are really beneficial, especially if you're in our ecoregion. Rob Gajir is a researcher at UMass, and he's been studying which plants support the insects that are most at risk of going extinct, the ones that are really declining in numbers. So I have a spreadsheet of those too. Those are also really good plants to have so we can keep those insects reproducing. So another aspect of a healthy ecosystem is soil. And this is something else I think a lot of us grow up or not taught much about early in our gardening years, is that soil is full of health. And there are many, many microorganisms in the soil, but one of them is mycorrhizal fungi. So I'm sure you all recognize mushrooms. You know, we eat some of them, not all of them, but you know, they pop up after a rain. And those are the fruiting body of mycorrhizal fungi. So the mycorrhiza are these fibers that are underground. They're on every continent. There's vast networks of them. There are hundreds of different species, and they're really important part of the ecosystem. They connect to roots of plants. They transfer nutrients between plants. They transfer water. They're really important in storing carbon in soil, so they're really essential in helping us deal with climate change. There's a book on one of the resource slides called Finding the Mother Tree by Suzanne Simard, and she's a researcher out in the Pacific Northwest who discovered a lot of these fungi plant relationships. And her book has some great stories in it. For instance, she was talking about one situation where there was a hillside that was moist at the bottom and very dry at the top, and the fungi were transferring water uphill to the plants that needed it. She also talked about different species of trees that exchanged nutrients at different times of the year and supported each other. So that's another aspect of nature that's really fascinating and really important to learn about. The fungi also protect plants from disease, and because they don't photosynthesize, they get nutrients from plants. So again, this is a mutually beneficial relationship where they're depending on each other and helping each other survive. So in this next section, I'm going to talk about gardening for biodiversity, which really means thinking in ecological terms, gardening to support these interactions between different species that help each other thrive. So early on, I talked about how loss of habitat was the major reason for the big decline in insects. And there isn't enough wild habitat left to support all these species that are at risk. There are 40 million acres of lawn in the US, which is equal to the acreage of our continental national parks. In Massachusetts, 20% of our land is in lawn, and lawns are ecosystem deserts. I'm going to tell you some ways to make them more beneficial than conventional lawns, but conventional lawns, as you can see on the left, have one species growing in them. They're kept mowed, they're not allowed to flower, um, and often there are many pesticides and herbicides used on them to keep them looking very uniform. So there's nothing for birds or insects to live on in a conventional lawn. On the right, you can see this is just a sidewalk strip along the street, but it's full of flowers that are going to provide nectar and pollen. They'll provide seed. And I'm going to show you another way of comparing lawns and wildflowers. If you look at the far left, that little mustache is turf grass. And if you look at all these other flowers, they have many different shapes of flowers that, as I said, will support many different kinds of insects, food for adults and their young. A lot of the foliage will provide shelter for insects, and these long roots help store nutrients. They help absorb stormwater. They help store carbon in the soil. Really, the turf grass is kind of storing a tiny bit of carbon, and it's keeping the soil from blowing away. But you can see how native plants are so much more beneficial in many ways. So again, Doug Tallamy, the entomologist that I was talking about, he has a website called Homegrown National Park, and he's advocating that we all plant at least half of our lawns with at least 70% native habitat. So this is an example from a suburb west of Boston. That used to be all lawn in front of that house. And now it has native trees and shrubs and grasses and flowering plants, and it's just going to be providing a lot of habitat. And that amount of habitat is wonderful, but you can also have a tiny amount of habitat and it's still beneficial. So if you do have a lawn, you could think about how are you actually using it? Do you use it for walking paths? Do you use it for recreation? Anything that's just being mown and isn't really in use, you can turn them into life-supporting habitat. And you can start small, whatever is comfortable, whatever's affordable, even a window box of native plants can be beneficial. So I'm going to talk about ways to manage lawns so that they do provide some benefit. So if you look at this picture, you can see the left side is getting a little bit tall. It has clover and probably some other flowers blooming in it. The right side is too short for anything to flower. So here are the guidelines for having a biodiverse lawn. Mow it every 2 to 3 weeks. Let the grass get 3 to 4 inches tall. This slide will be in the resource slides. You can leave the grass clippings because they are good fertilizer. Avoid all pesticides, herbicides, and chemical fertilizers. I'll talk a little later about the detriments of all of those. You can either allow small flowering plants like clover, self-heal, violet, bluets, even dandelions, or you can plant them. People don't usually plant dandelions, but you can plant these other ones. And what happens is they're providing nectar, they're providing pollen. So pollinating insects will visit the lawn. And then amazingly, birds will come to the lawn because they eat insects. So you start getting this nice little wildlife effect in your property when you let this happen. And that's really great to see. So this will be in the resource slides too. These are plants that you can allow or plant in your lawn, both native and non-native ones that can be beneficial. And also there's plants that you should remove either because they're going to crowd everything out or because they're actually toxic or invasive. And then there's a link at the bottom here. Wild Seed Project is a terrific organization in Maine, and they have a handout called Diversify Your Lawn, which takes you through lots of different ways of doing it. So if you decide you're going to add natives to your property, there are a number of ways of getting started. And first, the first steps are what you would do with any kind of garden. You want to assess your site. So how much light do you get? Do you get full sun, part shade, full shade? How much moisture do you have? Are you in an area that tends to stay wet? Is it kind of medium? Does it vary? Are you experiencing drought frequently? And I want to say there are native plants for all these different conditions, and I will give you resources about that. So first you figure out what kind of plants will be happy in the area that you have. And then you think about what kind of habitat do you want? Do you want to just add native plants to a flowering bed you already have? Which is how I originally started. I learned about, I had a very pretty garden with lots of different flowers in it. It was kind of like an outdoor art studio for me. And then I started hearing about the decline in insects and how important native plants were, which I had never known. So the first thing I did was just commit to anytime I was going to put in a new plant, I'd put in native plants. And then eventually, over a number of years, I started hearing how dire the situation was, and I ended up giving all my non-natives away, and my garden is now almost completely native. So there are many different ways to get involved and many levels of commitment to native. So whatever works for you, whatever you add is good. So you can add native plants to a bed you have. You can start a brand new garden bed, maybe, take away some lawn and put in a new garden. You can add trees to a lawn. You can create a little woodland area. You can turn it into a meadow. And as I said, you can also make the lawn more beneficial. And then if you're it's good to emulate nature as much as you have room for. And that is nature, if you look in the woods in particular, nature allows things to grow in layers. So there's ground covers, there's taller perennials, there's shrubs, there's trees, there's vines. So all those levels of habitat are beneficial for different kinds of insects and different birds. They live in different levels of plant life. And then you always want to be identifying and removing invasive plants and checking for them often because they will sneak back in. But if you get on top of them and keep an eye out for them, then it's not hard. So here are ways of providing habitat that will support life. So the first one is food, which are, the flowers and leaves. And there are ways to do this to increase the benefit of growing native flowers. So you want a variety of native flowers that will be in bloom from spring, early spring through frost, because that will support a wide variety of insects. There are different insects that are active at different times in the growing season. If you plant in groups of at least 3 to 5, this is if you have space. If you don't worry about it. For one thing, that looks nice for us. You kind of get a mass of color and texture, but it also makes it easier for the bees to get food. So again, I'm going to contrast native bees with honeybees. Honeybees can fly miles to find food, and they bring all their buddies with them. Most native bees can only fly up to hundreds of yards. So in order to not wear them out, finding one flower that they like here and one way over there. If you grow them in groups, they can do a lot of feeding in one area, and that helps them save energy. So if you include keystone plants, the ones that support the most species, that's helpful. If you include the plants that support endangered insects, that's helpful. Again, the principle of growing 70% native biomass. So if you can, aim for that. And if you want to go beyond that, that's, the more the better, but that's kind of the ideal amount. And then remember to include the native shrubs and trees and grasses. They're not only providing food, but they'll provide shelter, which I'll talk about a little bit more. So here's one of my shelter slides. So again, as opposed to honeybees that build these big hives, 70% of native bees nest in the ground, and some of them need access to bare soil to be able to dig their tunnels. So if you have enough space to leave some soil bare, the bees will access it. And there, in the year actually that I took out most of my non-native plants, I was replanting, but with small plants, so I had a lot of space in the ground. And I noticed in June, just all these bees kind of swarming back and forth about a foot above the ground. And it lasted for about 2 weeks. Those are minor bees. And the females, oops, sorry about that. The females were digging tunnels and making nests, and the males were looking for mates. So one thing I want to add is that most native bees do not sting. It's insects that are protecting a hive that tend to sting, and most native insects are not doing that. I have been gardening around them for years and brushing against them and brushing against the plants they're feeding on. They are not interested in humans. They just want to, enjoy the feast you've put out for them. So don't be worried about that. 30% of native bees nest in cavities, which they either find or create in dead wood, in live wood, in hollow stems, or in brush piles. I'll talk a little more about how to preserve habitat for those bees. Bumblebees will nest in cavities underground or in trees. They will often use holes that have been dug by other species, including rodents, and they'll find sheltered areas under piles of brush, clumps of grasses, and leaf piles. So that's all habitat. That's all important shelter so that the insects can survive the whole year. It's not just feeding them with flowers, it's making sure they have places to live. So in order to provide shelter for them year round, it's important to skip cleaning up in the fall. So again, this is really different from how most of us are taught to garden, where anything that's brown, you tidy up your garden and take it all out and get rid of it. You actually want to leave all of it. You leave the plant stems standing all winter. Insects will nest in them, they'll lay eggs in them, birds will eat the seeds. You leave leaves lying on the ground. When insects will overwinter in them. One of the reasons why oak trees are so beneficial is because there's a lot of insects that start nesting in the leaves on the trees, and they come down in the leaves and they're nesting on the ground in the leaves. So if you're cleaning all those leaves up, you're throwing away the next generation of insects and also taking away food from birds, because birds will forage in all this leftover debris for insects. So anything that nature tends to leave lying around, rocks, dead and living trees, brush piles, leaf piles, dried grasses, tree limbs, they're all providing shelter. So, if you're living in a small area or if you're right on a city street, you might not leave all that stuff there. I do leave, so I garden both in Western Mass and also in Cambridge on a busy street. And um, I do want people to be attracted to growing native plants. So I don't leave, like tree limbs lying in my garden. I don't want it to look too neglected, even though I know it's beneficial. So there's some things I take out and put in the back where people aren't going to see them as easily. So you can decide how to manage this so that you're providing ecological benefit, but maybe some of your neighbors might get upset, but a lot of people are starting to learn. You can put up a pollinator habitat sign. You can make the edges or the areas closer to public areas tidier. And then I just want to say, look for the beauty. I mean, one of the things that I love is when you leave all these plants up as they're dying in the fall and through the winter, they create these, not only are they providing benefit to insects, but I think they're beautiful. You have all these different shapes. You have seed heads, you have dried flower pods, you have different colors of dried leaves. And I just think the textures are beautiful. And then when it snows, it's like you have all these little sculptures in your garden. So I've just come to love that. And I think gardens look kind of sterile when they're cleaned up and you've lost all that beautiful plant life. So what do you do in the spring if you haven't cleaned up in the fall? So what I do is clean up the leaves only where I really need to. So you don't want to have really thick, wet leaves on top of most plant crowns. I mean, there's some plants that did evolve in the woods and they'll just grow right up through them. But a lot of the plants that you put in your garden might be from a prairie or someplace, where they're not used to being covered with that much foliage. So I gently push the leaves away from the plant crowns. I leave leaves between the plants. If it's really thick, I'll take some leaves out and I've created a leaf pile. And if you let them decompose, they're actually the best mulch and fertilizer you can use. Nature has just, evolved to create life, and it actually does a better job of it than we do. You don't need to buy fertilizer. You also don't need to enrich the soil for native plants. Enriching the soil is for vegetables and some of the exotic plants or imported roses that, are used to that, but our native plants don't need that. You can just use what nature is providing. So if you can clear some soil for grand nesting bees, that's helpful. Once the air gets to consistently around 50 degrees Fahrenheit in the daytime, you can cut the plant stems to 12 to 18 inches. Um, take the stems you've cut if you have a place to put them aside. There still might be insects emerging from them. I do that. I have to say, I never see any insects. I think it's a much subtler process. They're not all like flying out in swarms. But if you can keep those, anything that's still living in there will have a chance to emerge. And the new foliage that starts growing in the spring will grow up around the stalks that you've left and cover them. And I've already said, if you stack the stems on the property, the bees will continue to hatch. So, and if you're, again, by a really busy area where people are walking by, you might want to cut things a little earlier or cut them a little shorter to make it look tidier. But if you're not worried about that, then just, follow what I've suggested, and that's what's most beneficial for other species. So another way to support life is by having healthy soil. And I talked about there are just billions of organisms in a tiny amount of soil. So to protect soil health, you want to minimize tilling. There's all those fungal connections that I talked about. So if you're not digging too much, you're leaving those fungi operating, connecting to plants, and you're also protecting bee nests. Now, obviously, if you're weeding or planting something, you have to dig a hole. So whatever you need to do, do, but don't dig more than you need to. And avoid using chemicals. Many chemicals will directly harm insects, they'll harm the plants, but they'll also harm the health of the organism in the soil that we can't see. So there's research showing that the more variety of plants that are growing together, the more diversity the planting is, that leads to greater plant health and greater soil health. And I'm speculating that that's because the more variety there is, the more different kinds of mycorrhizal fungi and other organisms are interacting with those plants and communicating with them and delivering resources to them. And so it just increases the health of the soil. And then also, the more diversity of plants in the ground, they found the more carbon gets stored. So that's, again, helping with climate change. And again, to protect the soil, leave fallen leaves as much as possible. They're providing really important nutrients and also remove invasive plants. So I may have talked about most of this already, the importance of avoiding chemicals, the pesticides, kill insects indiscriminately. There are many companies that claim it's only going to kill ticks, it's only going to kill mosquitoes, and basically they kill indiscriminately. Also, those companies advertise that you should be killing insects that are actually really beneficial. So I ignore them. Don't hire them. Herbicides will kill the plants that beneficial insects depend on. And these and chemical fertilizers, again, will poison the bees in the ground. They seep into waterways and they damage the life in our waterways. And again, they disrupt life underground. And then many of them last for years in soil and plants. So it's really important if you're planting at a native plant nursery, you're going to be safe. If you're not planting, buying. If you're buying from a conventional nursery that carries native plants, you need to find out if they've been treated because some may have been treated with chemicals that will poison the insects and they also may stay in the plant and affect the soil for several years. So you really want to get pesticide and herbicide-free plants. So here's some other ways of supporting life in the garden. Insects and birds need water, so it's helpful to, unless you have a natural water source, to have some kind of, even just a saucer with water in it, with pebbles in it, so insects can stand on it. And just, rinse it out every few days so mosquitoes aren't breeding in it and to keep it clean. This is something that's getting a little more public attention now, that nightlight is really detrimental to many species, including humans, that we evolved, all the species on Earth evolved to have moonlight and starlight at night and nothing else. And especially in the last 50 years, we just have artificial light everywhere. And it's really bad for health. It's really destructive to both insects and birds for a variety of reasons. And there are actually a lot of pollinators that are out at night. Here's some nighttime moths. So to help minimize the detrimental effects of nightlight, if you can leave them off, that's ideal. If you have lights, make sure they shine only where you really need them for safety. You can switch to lights that are on the yellow end of the spectrum, rather than sort of warm rather than cold blue. Use low wattage bulbs. And if you really need to have them, you can put them on motion sensors. So those are all ways to, and even be careful of the lights that shine out of your windows at night. They're going to affect the insects that are out there. So We need to adapt to change in gardens. There's always reasons why things change, but particularly adapting to climate change is something we have to watch. So, we're dealing with more heat, with drought, with flooding rains, and it's important to watch your plants and see if they're happy or if they need different conditions. So in Cambridge, where it gets much hotter and drier than it does out in the hill towns, um, I had a native shade garden in front of the house. It's next to a very hot street and under a tree that's drinking a lot of water. And for several summers in a row, by July, my ginger and other native plants, it's a native ginger, were turning brown and looking really unhappy. So I moved them behind the house, which is really close by, and they're fine there. It's just a little bit cooler there, and they're just thriving. So you need to keep an eye on your plants, and if they're consistently not happy, try to figure out what's wrong and if you have a better site for them. The other thing I did was research drought-resistant plants, and that's what I've put in the front now, and those plants are doing much better. So again, there are good plants for different conditions, and I'll share resources for you to help you find the right plants. So when you're plant shopping, whether you're going to a nursery, looking in a catalog, or talking to a landscaper, you want to look for the native plant species, not hybrids. Pesticide-free plants. If you can get plants grown from seed, that's ideal. Watch out for companies that are trying to trick you into buying plants that aren't really native to your region. And if you're not seeing what you want, tell the nursery, tell the landscaper, because as the demand has grown, the supply has grown. There's a lot more little native plant nurseries popping up, at least in Massachusetts, I'm sure in other places too, and people sharing seeds and sharing plants. So, let people know what you want, and there will be more of it. And I prefer to shop at native plant nurseries. Sometimes that's not convenient, so you can go to other nurseries and tell them what you're looking for. And then this will be in the resource slides. I have a spreadsheet of nurseries that carry native plants that you can either visit or there's somewhere you can mail order. And one of the pages shows nurseries that carry all natives. So before I go through the resource slides, I just want to, talk about how joyful this is. We're facing very serious environmental problems, and this is a very joyful way of addressing one of them and making a difference and seeing life thrive. And so I really recommend it for your own pleasure as well as the benefit to the environment and our future well-being. So I'm going to quickly show you the resource slides. Megan will send these to you. I'm not going to go through this. This is a summary of garden practices that support biodiversity. I've talked about all of these. These are spreadsheets and lists of native plants. I have a really comprehensive spreadsheet that will show you, you can click on it and see a picture, light, sun, moisture, height, bloom time, if it's drought resistant, salt resistant, rabbit resistant. There's just lots of information in these lists. This is the list of plants that you can grow or should avoid in your lawn. This is what to look for in nurseries. These are dealing with problems that are common in the garden, like invasive plants, rabbits, jumping worms. So here's more information about all of that. I like to put in a slide about how honeybees affect native plants and other insects, just because most people don't know, and I think it's important. Here are places to do native plant research. Native Plant Trust has 2 nurseries in Massachusetts, and they have a terrific website and a lot of educational offerings, and they have a native plant tool that you can use to search for plants with particular characteristics. Prairie Moon Nursery, Ladybird, Johnson Wildflower Center, both have great websites. There's a spreadsheet of the plants that support endangered insects. And I think this is a list of keystone plants of New England. Here are organizations and websites that are local that also have lots of great information. Hampden-Hampshire Conservation District hosting this talk tonight, but they have a lot of other events. The Massachusetts Pollinator Network, I'm on the steering committee, and we've actually now joined with Grow Native. So we try to be kind of a hub of education and communication for different pollinator groups in Massachusetts. Grow Native has a great website. I put in a pollinator pathway link for Massachusetts and another one for Connecticut because I heard a couple people from Connecticut signed up for this talk. So there's just, and here's national organizations that also offer terrific resources. These are newsletters that are informative and fun to read. Here's many different books that are really helpful. And then I just want to end with this quote by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass. She's Native American, and so she grew up in a culture that was very connected to nature and also became an environmental biologist. And so she has the science tradition and the indigenous tradition. And she said, in some native languages, the term for plants translates to those who take care of us, which I find very moving. And now we need to take care of them. So I'm going to stop sharing. And here we are.
What a wonderful way to conclude. I love that quote.
Thank you.
Would anybody like to raise a question? All right, go for it.
I'm not sure if it's a question or just a comment, but I have a very wet backyard. And years ago, I had bought a little 6-pack of Japanese primroses, and they loved it, and they really took over. It was almost a monoculture. Now, I don't know why, maybe there's more sun or what, there's getting fewer and fewer. But of course, I love them because they're beautiful. They're not native. Um, a friend of mine brought her boyfriend once who was an expert entomologist, and he was walking through and he said, "Ha, I counted 19 pollinators in your Japanese primroses." So that made me feel better.
Yeah.
Uh, I was just when you were talking about, that they don't support a lot of species. I try to Google how many per species, but didn't find anything. So I'm hoping that in all the resources that are going to be shared with us, that I'll find something. And I do try, since then, I do try to put native plants as much as I can. It is expensive though. Those native plants are expensive. So I can buy like three, I can't buy a lot, but but yeah, I do have, buttonbush and cardinal flowers and lots of different native dogwoods. I would like to do more,
Mhm.
and
So
I'm
I have
looking forward to your list.
great. So I have a couple comments. One is, I don't know if he saw 19 insects or 19 different kinds of pollinators.
Different kinds, different
That's
kinds,
really
different kinds.
impressive because
I know.
often, like someone will say, oh, I have so many bees, but they have honeybees and they have the most common kind of bumblebee. And then they're not supporting the ones that, need the most help. But maybe that plant just has something special that attracts more insects. So that's nice. The other thing is in the spreadsheets, you can look, and also at Native Plant Trust, you can kind of select characteristics, but you can choose plants that like wet conditions and find them. And then the other thing about cost, I'm actually going to add a slide, Megan, before I'll send you the slide separately tomorrow to share with everyone. But there are some ways to save money, and I'll add a slide about that. If you connect with some of the pollinator groups, some people have plant swaps. Some people are teaching each other how to grow native plants from seed. So and then there are also some places that will have a special sale, like Native Plant Trust. If you help them unload their truck, they'll give you a big discount in the spring. So there's some oddball stuff like that too. But I do recommend getting in touch with the native pollinator groups because nobody wants to spend tons of money, or most people don't, on their garden, and there are some ways to save. So and the more people that are doing this, the more plants we have to share with each other too.
Yeah, exactly. The native plants are so generous with their seeds. Let's see. I'm looking to see if any questions popped up in the chat. Anybody else wanted to ask anything of Amy while we've got her? We've got her for a little bit longer.
I'll go again, but I was kind of told, don't get plants from, plant sales and like the cheap ones because of the danger of bringing jumping worms into your.
Yeah. Yeah, that is an issue. So if you know you don't have jumping worms, then you do want to be careful not to introduce them. And so something you can do, it takes some work, but you can get either, from someone who is sure that they don't have them, or you can wash the roots, but you should wash it where you're getting them so that you're not washing jumping worm seeds off on your property. So there are some plant swaps that have that set up where you can kind of carefully wash the roots under a hose or into a bucket, and then, maybe wrap it in newspaper to keep it moist till you get home.
Well, thank you so much. Good night, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.